It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman, and you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. If you reach out to me through my email, oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Very excited about today's show. Dan Luzetter. He's out with a brand new book called The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, the CIA, and the Corruption of American Journalism. Now, you can find him at danluzetter.com and also, too, on Twitter as Dan Luzetter. You want to meet him in person? February 22nd, Cloud and Leaf Bookstore in Manzanita, Oregon. Mr. Dan Luzetter, are you there?
I am here. Thanks, Ed, for having me on today.
Hey, thanks so much for giving me a second chance. Because I got sick, I couldn't do it, and you rebooked with me. So thank you so much, man. I really appreciate that.
Glad to be here.
Before we get into the book here, The Manchurian Journalist, about Lawrence Wright, tell us about yourself. Who is Dan Luzetter?
Well, Dan Luzetter is an old-time newspaper guy. Actually, I fumbled around out of high school, wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and wound up working as a reporter by the time I was 17. By the time I was 19, I was on police beat, and I don't know what most people know about newspapers back in the early 70s, but it was a kind of exciting sort of life where things were happening constantly. You were under deadline, you were in fast-moving newsrooms, and I was hooked on it at a very early age, and I stayed with it. I ended up becoming a columnist for a large daily newspaper and shared a Pulitzer Prize doing that. Moved on into investigative reporting in the 1980s, investigated lots of crime and corruption, exposed a lot of public corruption, won an American Bar Association award for exposing corruption in the federal courts. So I just have spent most of my life as, behind the deadline and behind the typewriter and the computer and writing stories about people's lives and things that happen.
A couple of things. First of all, what was the Pulitzer for?
Well, the Pulitzer was was won by the Fort Wayne News Sentinel in 1983 for stories on a series of floods. It was for general local reporting, and I was the lead writer on those stories, and of course was writing a column about people at the time, and so we got a lot of attention with that. It was a really interesting story, but probably one of the more minor stories I've done in the course of my career.
But also, too, a filmmaker.
I've worked on a documentary film on a case, cold case crime in Speedway, Indiana, home of the Indianapolis 500. I began investigating that case really in 1986 and became part of a police investigation after turning up suspects on my own in that case. And the case has still never been solved. I've continued to follow it, and I'm working on a documentary film with a filmmaker, Mike James, out of L.A., on this season of violence that occurred in 1978. Involved a lot of intrigue, also a lot of politics, and I think we have a good handle on why the crimes have never been solved.
Season of violence in 78. What was that?
Well, there was Speedway was a quiet little town on the outskirts of Indianapolis. It was only really active publicly when the Indianapolis 500 race was going on. But behind the scenes, there was a lot going on in Speedway. And in the summer of 1978, there was an inexplicable murder of a grandmother at a garage sale, and her garage in Speedway was killed execution style. And it kicked off a series of investigations into an individual who was, at the time, unknown to most people, was a prolific marijuana smuggler, a young guy in his 20s. And then following the grandmother's murder, there was a series of bombs just a month later that went off in Speedway, small bombs and trash cans, and eventually injured one person pretty severely. And then following that, a month and a half later, 4 kids were kidnapped out of a Burger Chef fast food restaurant and found murdered 15 miles away in the woods. And those crimes were created a scar on the community of Speedway. And the two of the crimes have never been solved, but the bombings were attributed to this young Indianapolis businessman who was a marijuana smuggler behind the scenes. And he was eventually convicted of the bombings, but our investigation has shown that this conviction was wrongful and that there were a lot of irregularities in convicting him. And as we've tracked the reasons for these crimes going unsolved, there are political elements involved that take us all the way to national politics.
Is this fellow still serving time for this?
No, he was released after serving 19 years. He now has a family. He's a businessman that is involved in business relationships with people in Ukraine. And has had a successful life post his conviction, but he spent most of his life trying to rectify this conviction on his record.
Oh, yeah, 19 years, man. Shush.
A long time down. Yeah.
Well, we have Leslie Sharp to thank for this interview, and also the interview you're going to hear after this with Walter Herbst about his new book coming out too. And Leslie Sharp, we had her on the show. She talked about the book by Hank Albarelli, Dallas Coup. Now, you were friends with Albarelli too.
I was. Hank and I worked together for over a year, almost 2 years, on various things. And he worked with me as I was putting together my book on journalism, the Manchurian Journalist. And Hank he had wonderful sources, particularly in the CIA and elsewhere around the world. And he was an incredible investigative reporter.
Yeah, I was telling you off the air, I tried so hard to get him to come back a second time. And he kept saying, as soon as the book is done. And it just breaks my heart. The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, the CIA, and the Corruption of American Journalism. What are we going to find here?
Well, the book is basically about journalism, but it's a story that started when I was freelancing for newspapers, New York Times, New York Daily News, and others. And I got a call one day from an editor of an obscure magazine in Florida called Freedom Magazine. And it turned out the magazine was owned by the Church of Scientology. And they asked me to take a look at the media coverage of the church and whether or not I thought, as they contended, there were problems with that coverage. And so I spent a considerable amount of time working with people from the church and looking at that coverage. And I worked on their magazine during the process for a while as a freelancer. And as I was doing that, one of their complaints was about a book that was written about the church called Going Clear, and it was written by a prolific journalist named Lawrence Wright. I don't think he's a household name, but he's done some significant work in American journalism, a writer for The New Yorker, published by major houses. And he won a Pulitzer Prize in 2008, if I'm recalling correctly, for the book The Looming Tower, which was very influential in our view on what happened on 9/11, Al-Qaeda, and those issues. But as I was doing the background research on the media coverage, I started taking a look at Lawrence Wright's background, and suddenly I was very much more interested in what I was finding there, because Wright had undisclosed ties to the Central Intelligence Agency through people who were in Dallas who were very, very involved in the agency's creation in the late 1940s and early 50s, and also in programs that were designed to propagandize the American public through journalistic outlets about attitudes and views. And so I traced that over a period of about a year. I traced those connections, those individuals, and I found a fascinating story how the U.S. State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency and people in the private community, banks, insurance companies, other places, law firms, had been very much involved in shaping programs that that helped to design what the public heard about the American culture, our political views, etc. And it's a matter that kind of has an interesting ring to it now as we're very much caught up in the ideas of fake news, of propaganda, of what you can believe and what you can't.
Yeah, and today it's even worse because you got these little TikToks and Reels just with complete disinformation just being churned out 24 hours a day, you know.
And at the same time, we've watched the decline of journalism.
Yeah.
As newspapers have disappeared. And with it, as I've said repeatedly, the infrastructure that provided the kind of journalism we used to have, and it was never perfect by any means, but at least that provided the kinds of structure for daily reporting, for reliable news, that infrastructure is disappearing very rapidly.
Yeah, and even more rapidly, we were watching the disintegration of the cable news networks, you know, losing money hand over fist and losing lawsuits
right.
in the past year. And that's so surface to begin with. And
it's a whole new environment and a brave new world out there in journalism. You know, as someone who literally grew up in newsrooms, coming of age and schooled in that kind of infrastructure, the things that you do as a journalist, and most importantly, the things you don't do as a journalist, I've seen tremendous change, and it saddens me in many ways that now we're not sure where to turn for reliable information. I think that's a very dangerous situation for democracy, if you will.
Now, when you talk about like the State Department and the CIA influence over these journalists, how nuts and bolts, how does that work? Does the journalist go to them and say, hey, I want to get on the payroll? Or did they come out of college? They were recruited? How does that work?
Well, it's never been, I don't think it's ever been entirely outlined in any particular place. And some of the work in the Manchurian Journalist carves some new ground on some things that have never been reported before. But it wasn't so much a matter of the CIA specifically bringing journalists in who wanted to be on the payroll. It was more a matter of recruiting people into particular jobs that were influential in the media. And it was not just newspapers or magazines. It was publishing houses.
Right.
And so one of the things that I found in tracking Lawrence Wright's history was that he had written a memoir in the middle 80s about his own experience as a young man during the Vietnam War who was anti-war, and his father was a prominent military man and a banker of a small bank, and he wrote about how he rejected those ideas and he wanted to do something different, and so he became a conscientious objector. So I started pulling apart his story about his conscientious objections and talked to a lot of conscientious objectors, because his experience in Dallas before a very tough draft board was that he wrote a single essay about his opposition to war, and they granted him his conscientious objector status on the basis of an essay. Yeah. That was completely unlike anything else I ever found for those who were proved as conscientious objectors. He and then talked in his memoir about as he was waiting to hear whether or not his conscientious objection status was approved, he went to a little summer publishing course called the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course in Boston for 6 weeks. And as I began to look into that course, I found that it was run by a woman named Helen Venn, who was the friend of every American author, who had high-level contacts in all of the major publishing houses, magazines, others. She had contacts with people in Rolling Stone, like Jan Wenner. She helped found a course similar to her own with Daniel Okrent and a famous American journalist, and others. And it turned out that she was really a liaison to this propaganda program with the CIA and the State Department. And she was very, very involved in that. But nothing was ever reported about these kinds of relationships. But what she did with her little summer class was recruit individuals from all over the country who were like-minded, who would serve well in the publishing industry as they picked authors to promote, as they picked ideas to promote. And so there was a substrata that existed at the time of trying to how would you say it most succinctly, to craft opinions within the American public about what was appropriate and what was not, going all the way into book publishing, going into magazine publishing. And Lawrence Wright was very much a part of all that, unbeknownst to the American public.
Yeah, I've always thought that the publishing was a big, filter, and you always see how they give these big contracts to somebody about to run for president, like they fund their cross-country tour, you know what I mean?
Right.
And then they pick their guy. But are they funded directly through like intelligence or capitalist agents? How's this funded?
Well, I think a lot of it was funded through off the books sorts of programs, but not all of it. There was a program called the Franklin Books Program. It was an international program to promote Western culture through book publishing. And Helen Venn was the State Department's liaison to that program. They went to foreign countries. They found authors who were sympathetic to Western ideas, to capitalism over communism, over socialism, etc. And they would promote them and bring them along. They brought along small publishing houses in foreign countries if they would publish the appropriate books. One of the things that Lawrence Wright wrote about was after his conscientious objection status was approved, he wanted to be out of the country and he was looking for a place to serve his public service requirement. Conscientious objectors have to serve. And he wound up, by serendipity, he said, finding a position at the American University in Cairo, where he went as a graduate student to teach English. Well, it turned out, as I looked further, that the teaching English as a second language was part of the program out of the State Department, was also connected to Helen Venn and others. And the American University, it turned out through intensive research, and I hired a researcher in Egypt to help me with this, they were an outpost for the CIA and a place where a lot of CIA recruiting was done for the Middle East. And there were others like Lawrence Wright who were conscientious objectors who went in and out of that program. Some of them went on to found foundations that promoted international relationships. But often they would those foundations would raise money, and those money streams would get into the funding of these programs to help create relationships that promoted Western culture behind the scenes.
I was even going to ask you before you mentioned, I guess the university system is also like funneling these people into these positions.
I'm sorry, I missed part of
that. The universities also funnel these people into these positions. Right. Yeah.
Well, if you look back, you find that the University of Michigan was virtually the sociology department was virtually running the government of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. University connections, university contacts, very important, especially in recruiting of individuals who are sympathetic to these ideas. And you can imagine those people who get preferential treatment by publishing houses or by magazines or picked up who are part of the club are able to promote ideas that may align with others but may not be completely independent. And the problem is that the general public and people like me don't know about it.
Right, but now that you've written about this, what's the reaction been? Like, are other people pointing their finger at Lawrence Wright?
Well, I think the reaction has actually been very small. I haven't heard anything from Lawrence Wright himself. I sought many times to interview him, and I used all of my investigative reporter tricks to try to do that. Lawrence Wright plays in a little Texas band, and I went down and heard a performance of his band and went up to talk to him afterwards and get him to sign a copy of his book on Scientology, and ask him repeatedly to sit down and talk to me about the history of his family's relationship with these organizations, but I could never convince him to do that. We haven't gotten much mainstream reaction. I've done quite a few podcasts and programs and radio shows like your own. I get a little feedback here and there about this, but nothing directly.
Now, you were saying also, too, that his family has connections?
So that was one of the first things that startled me, because Lawrence Wright talked about his father, who was, as I mentioned, a military man. He was a major in the Oklahoma National Guard, but he had served in World War II, won a Bronze Star. He also served in the Korean War. But as I looked farther, Wright talked about in his memoir his father being a banker who believed in community service and contributed many things to the East Dallas community. And the little storefront bank that he ran, Lakewood Bank and Trust, was certainly nothing large or influential. But as I dug into banking records, I found that the bank had been founded by a man named Robert G. Story. And Robert Story has had a low profile in American history, but he was extremely influential and extremely powerful. He was on the board for the executive reorganization of the federal government just before World War II. He was very involved with the State Department. He was head of the American Bar Association. He was a dean of the law school at Southern Methodist University. But he was also the individual who prevented the Attorney General in Texas from launching a separate murder investigation into the Kennedy assassination. He was with Earl Warren when Warren interviewed Jack Ruby in jail. And as it turned out, Story was also the chief trial prosecutor in the Nuremberg war trials. And he was one of the individuals responsible for bringing hundreds of ex-Nazi intelligence officers from the Eastern Front into the American CIA. And so he was the owner of Lakewood Bank and Trust, the man who hired Lawrence Wright's father, a guest at their house on frequent occasions, and his son, Charles Story, also a military individual, was one of Donald Wright's father's closest friends. Charles Story was also a close friend with one of the members of one of the organizers of the Bay of Pigs. The family had many connections going all the way into the elite establishment in New York that involved power brokers who were behind these programs that were designed to propagandize the American public. Lawrence Wright has never acknowledged any of these things, has never reacted to any of them. I've, as I said, asked him on several occasions to do so. But I can understand why he would not want to, because it opens a can of worms about what the influences were on him as a journalist, the undisclosed influences as he was writing his very powerful book, The Looming Tower, about Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Those kinds of things should be known to the public, and I think that the book helps illustrate some of these things that affected journalism, publishing, American culture, that were designed by intelligence agencies to help shape the American attitude. Those kinds of things I think are important to know about.
Yeah, and when you hear these connections, these are the guys that are really getting around, and then when I hear you talking about the in-depth investigation you're doing here, that they had to have gotten wind of this. So if everything was so innocent, you think he'd pull you aside and say, "Hey, Dan, let's have a beer." You go and take
Well, that's what I'm suggesting. Yeah. Let's sit down and have a beer and have a conversation about this.
Yeah, man, you're on a bunny trail, Dan. Let's have a talk.
Not only were they aware of it, but at several steps along the way, I tried to explain to Wright exactly what I was doing, and in the end, I wrote him a long letter and explained exactly what I was going to report, and asked for his response. He's a writer for the New Yorker, which is a very influential magazine, prominent, and one of my favorite magazines has been, for decades. But I also contacted the editor at the New Yorker to ask him about these issues that had never been brought up about one of his major writers, and David Remnick, the editor, never bothered to respond. These questions go unanswered, and I ask at the end of the book that the Pulitzer Committee take a look at the history in light of the Pulitzer that they awarded to Lawrence Wright, as to whether or not this was appropriate and whether these influences should have been known. But I didn't hear anything from Columbia University either.
What about other repercussions? Any other kind of, problems, issues?
I've been an investigative reporter since 1984, full-time, more or less. And people always ask me about repercussions. I've investigated organized crime. I worked my way on the inside of the Chicago outfit. I've investigated prisons and prison conditions all over the country. I've written about those things and a lot about unsolved crimes. Mm. And I've never worried about there particularly being any danger or people coming after me or anything. And I didn't worry about it in this case either, because it doesn't do any good to worry. You stand up and speak your truth, and you be ready for the consequences as a result. But I can't say that I've ever felt particularly threatened. I've known people in the CIA. I was a guest at the 50th birthday party of the CIA station chief in Paris in 1990. The working around these things as an investigative reporter, I think people tend to believe that repercussions can be swift and dangerous. We've heard about instances where those things have occurred, but most of what I'm writing about and have written about is history, and it's well documented. And I know how to spend my time digging into records and following leads, and that's what I've done a good part of my life. So I don't fear repercussions from that. If Lawrence Wright has something to say that contends that I made errors or was wrong about any aspect, I've given him plenty of opportunity to say so in advance. And if he wants to say so now, I'm prepared to defend what I've written and what I've had to say. As I noted, it's well documented material, and I rely on documents and not people's supposition.
Real quick, you had mentioned before that one of the leaders of the Bay of Pigs was connected to his father, I believe, or Mr. Story. Which Bay of Pigs leader was that? Would you know his name?
That was, I blanked on his name when I said that. He was the brother of the mayor of Dallas, the mayor who was in office when Kennedy was assassinated. And for some reason, I'm blanking on the name.
Well, that's okay, but that's a very interesting connection that I'm sure the audience want to look into. The brother of the mayor of Dallas.
Yeah, and he was also, as I said, he was a close friend of Charles Story, right. Robert Story's son. And this individual, before the Kennedy assassination, was touring Texas and other places with anti-Kennedy speeches around the state and elsewhere. And he was a colonel in the Air Force, and he had been the number 2 man to Dulles within the CIA. So, these powerful and close connections of individuals who were tied to the agency are important to look at. And,
yeah, that's a very interesting connection I've never heard before. And the mayor of Dallas would certainly have a lot of connections with the police department in Dallas, and a lot of influence over there.
Well, I mean, there are many things that happened that were never fully understood, I think, by the American public. And the Jack Ruby matter, I think, is one of the most fascinating of all. Cabell, Charles Cabell was his name. So as I get older, I find that happens to be more. But Charles Cabell was very involved in, and he was fired along with Dallas by Kennedy in the wake of the Bay of Pigs. But he was a very close friend of Charles Story and of Robert Story. And, of course, Robert Story was very close to Allen Dulles as well. Robert Story used to send him crates of grapefruit, Texas grapefruit at Christmas. And, these are the things that you find, these little details that you find when you're an investigative reporter, because you're curious and you're hungry. As you know, as an investigator, that one detail leads to a new one. And and people will say, "Well, how did you notice that?" But because one guy that'll just slip right by them. They won't stop thinking, "What, the mayor of Dallas, his brothers with the cat around there?" Well, I spent many years investigating prison conditions in state and federal prisons, and I learned to deal with inmates and how often the stories you hear may have a small bit of truth in them and a lot of untruth. And I learned to follow those little bits of truth down the path to find where they come from. And I did the same thing with Lawrence Wright. When most people read his memoir, they probably accepted the idea that he became a conscientious objector on the strength of an essay. But if you take a look in history at how hard people had to work, I tracked down, despite the National Archives fire that destroyed most of the relevant records in the 1970s, I was able to track down a sheet of conscientious objectors that were approved by the Dallas Draft Board for Lawrence Wright's birth year. There were 8 of them. I found them. I tracked some of them down and asked them questions. Most were ministers or somehow religiously affiliated, Quakers, whatever. The only one that wasn't was Lawrence Wright. And the only one that I could find that didn't have to make a presentation, bring witnesses, etc., was Lawrence Wright. It may have helped that his father had a friend who was a longtime member of the Dallas Draft Board. There might have been other reasons, but certainly it raises significant questions about the truth of Lawrence Wright's account in his own memoir. So you have to, as an investigator, as you know, you have to pull apart the fine details within a story to find where the thread is that indicates something is distorted.
Yeah, and like you said, you're right. A lot of witnesses, some of their stuff is BS, or some of their stuff, their memory is wrong, or they're just wrong, they're inaccurate, or they have political biases for their opinions. And you have to overlook that and just try to, take out the kernels of truth and follow that. But in the small world department, okay, I met Mr. Lou Zetter through Leslie Sharp. And I met Leslie Sharp through Walter Herbst, and we're going to be playing Walter Herbst right after this. And the subject of that conversation is who gave the order to Jack Ruby to kill Oswald. And that book is coming out. It's called The Last Resort, Beyond Last Resort, the JFK Assassination, the Need to Protect West Berlin, and Why a Second Invasion of Cuba Never Happened. Now, Mr. Dan Luzetter, by the way, too, you can find him at danluzetter.com. You can find him at Dan Luzetter at Twitter. And also, to February 22nd, you can meet him in person. Cloud and Leaf Bookstore, Manzanita, Oregon. You had mentioned other connections. Are there more connections to JFK assassination to Mr. Wright?
Well, I think there are a number of them, but primarily that revolves around his father's friend, Robert Story. Robert Story was also influential in the composition of the Warren Commission. And one of those individuals that was on the Warren Commission, if you look back, was John McCloy. And John McCloy had been Assistant Secretary of War during World War II. He was a lawyer who went to Amherst. I traveled to Amherst and looked where his archives are kept, and I went through John McCloy's archives because of his relationship with Robert Story. Story, as I mentioned, had been head of the American Bar Association and head of the International Bar Association. And John McCloy was a banker, was a businessman who became a banker, head of Chase Manhattan Bank, head of the Ford Foundation, head of the Rockefeller Foundation. It was under his control that the Ford Foundation basically supported the American University in Cairo, which was an outpost for the CIA. The relationships of course, Allen Dulles was also on the Warren Commission, fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, but wound up in that influential position with McCloy. They both had very close connections to Robert Story. There's so much more to know about Story's activities. And I say in the book, this really scratches the surface. It tells some details about Story's real role in American society and his influence over secrecy. But his relationship with John McCloy was extraordinarily powerful. He oversaw the internment of the Japanese during the World War II in camps in the U.S. He was extraordinarily influential and powerful, and he cut his teeth as a lawyer investigating something called the Black Tom incident, the German agents in World War I blowing up a munitions dump on Long Island. He tracked that case and went after reparations from the Germans and developed very close relationships as a result with German companies, as did Allen Dulles' law firm. And so at the end of World War II, when we were developing our Central Intelligence Agency and the idea of a civilian intelligence agency facing outward, not supposed to do anything domestically, McCloy, Story, and others in their circle were putting together a very different kind of intelligence network that also engaged in political issues within the country. So I think there is so much more to know about how John McCloy got appointed to the Warren Commission, of how the Warren Commission was controlled, and what individuals like Robert Story had an influence over how it reached its conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald, against all odds, worked alone to assassinate John F. Kennedy.
Now, I'm sure there's a lot of information about McCloy and Story in your book here, The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, the CIA and the Corruption of American Journalism. But do you think you have enough for a second book just on that topic?
Well, I don't know that at this late stage of my life I'll ever get to that second book, but I would certainly encourage other investigative reporters who are interested in this topic to pick up the thread. Be happy to talk to them about it. I'm at work on this documentary film on this cold case in Indiana, and also working on a book that I've been trying to finish for a number of years about the true nature of the Chicago mob. And as I mentioned, I was taken on the inside by an individual who had very close ties to the very top of the Chicago organization. And he was a very interesting character. He was Tony Accardo's midnight pinochle partner. Tony Accardo, Big Tuna, was head of the Chicago mob in the 50s, 60s, on into his death in the 90s. But this individual that I got close to, he was a rare book collector, and he was a historian in his own right. And part of his historical interest was the mob itself. And after I had known him for 10 years, he said, you really ought to write a book about the fact that Al Capone never ran the Chicago mob. And I was intrigued by that, and I began to follow that line and discovered that was true. And this individual introduced me to many people within the Chicago outfit. And I came to understand that a Russian Jew named Jake Guzik was the real mastermind behind the Chicago organization. He was there before Capone and was there well after Capone and ran it into the 1950s. So I've been working on a book about called Guzik's Legacy, the true story of the myth of Al Capone. And in the course of this individual introducing me to people, he put me together with the son of Jake Guzik, who was still alive at the time. And I spent several days with him going over details of what Chicago was like when the Chicago organization was originally crafted. My source's main argument was that the Chicago mob was never Italian either. It was multi-ethnic. It was Jewish. It was Russian. It was Irish. There were many different elements. But we think in history, as we think about Al Capone and his control and development of the Chicago mob, we think about it being the mafia and Italian in origin and Italian in character. But that's a distortion of history, too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I guess it comes from those old Elliot Ness TV shows that was produced by Ricky Desi Arnaz Jr., the Cuban, who, by the way, was friends with Al Capone and his son over there, too. What's the name of do you have a working title for that book, and when can we expect that?
It's called Guzik's Legacy. And I'm still finishing it. The book is written. Filling in some details on some additional things, but the book also has a political character because one of the stories it tells is how Jake Guzik wanted to extend the organization's activities into Phoenix. And that was a prime territory. Most of Phoenix organized crime was run locally. And so Guzik attempted to take over the organized crime in Phoenix, but he was stopped by a businessman in Phoenix who was rather influential. And that businessman stopped him by having Guzik's son, Charlie, the man I interviewed many years later, having him arrested on morals charges, and they threw him in prison for 20 years. He was gay. And at that time, in the 1950s, homosexuality was certainly suppressed. And so he was arrested for having relations with other men, and they put him in prison for 20 years and effectively kept the Chicago mob out because of that. But the man who was responsible for getting Charlie Guzik arrested is a name everybody knows, Barry Goldwater. And I can document this through records and through the testimony of individuals and interviews with individuals that I did over the course of probably 6-7 years. Wow.
What was his position at the time? Prosecutor or something? What was he doing at the time that he could influence that?
He was a businessman. He was head of Businessman's Association. And he developed a relationship with a rather famous individual out of the Chicago organization, a guy named Willie Byoff. Willie Byoff was with a man named George Brown in the 30s and 40s, ran a labor scam against Hollywood movie studios. And they finally got caught. And after extracting millions of dollars to ensure labor peace at the studios, they finally got caught, and Byoff and Brown both rolled over major figures in Chicago and testified against them. Paul the Waiter, Rika, Cherry Nose Gallo, Frank Nitti, others. And they were arrested in connection with this, and Rika and others went to prison. Nitti, who was been characterized as a killer in American history, was actually a very mild-mannered man. He was a barber that Jake Guzik had brought into the organization because he knew him and he was loyal. And Nitti couldn't take the idea of going to prison and committed suicide in connection with these arrests and the convictions. But Byoff and Brown disappeared from the scene after testifying against the mob. And it wasn't until 1954, some 10 years later, that Bayoff was assassinated. He was blown up in his pickup truck outside his house in Phoenix. Well, it turned out that the reason was not his testimony against the mob bosses. The reason was his betrayal of Jake Guzik, because he was the person that told Barry Goldwater about Charlie Guzik's sexual proclivities and initiated that situation where Charlie was arrested and imprisoned. And it was when Jake Guzik found out about that Willie Bayoff was blown up in Phoenix. That's never been reported. And
that's all great stuff, man. You got to promise me you'll come back and talk about that, and don't put it off too long. Like Hank did.
I promise not to do that.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be ironic if that pot dealer from Indianapolis with the bombs is the guy who bombed the guy with the truck? I guess it's impossible because of the ages, right?
Yeah.
But a couple of quick questions for you, okay? Back to the Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright. Lawrence Wright has all these connections to JFK. Did he ever write a book about JFK?
No.
Or an article?
No, he did say that he believed that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone.
Really?
He told a really fascinating story, which I have to think cannot be true based on my research. He had a cousin. Lawrence Wright had a cousin who lived with them for a while. And after he dropped out of high school, his cousin, he went to work for the funeral home and ambulance service in Dallas. And that ambulance service, O'Neill Funeral Home and Ambulance, they provided the hearse that picked up JFK. But Lawrence Wright told the story in his memoir that his cousin, working for them, regularly drove the ambulance, and the ambulance had a contract with the jail. And so he wrote about his cousin ferrying Jack Ruby back and forth to the hospital when he was being treated for the illness that eventually killed him, and that his cousin would have conversations with Jack Ruby as they rode back and forth to the hospital. Well, the time frame for his story was all wrong. His cousin did work for that ambulance service. I did find him. I was able to confirm that after a lot of work. I was never able to find the cousin after ever to talk to him. But the problem was that Jack Ruby wasn't ill when he was in the jail. They didn't discover his cancer until the last 2 months of his life, long after Lawrence Wright's cousin was no longer an ambulance driver there. And the aspect of him having the opportunity to talk to Ruby was not taken out of the jail to the hospital that I could find, other than a routine check. He was taken out to court. But I think that story was created out of whole cloth.
And what do you think the motive was? It's barstool, braggadocio? Or?
I think to show that Wright had some particularly intimate knowledge about Dallas and events there and things, while he never talked about his father's relationship with Robert Story or any of these really fascinating things. He never mentioned any of that. He did write about how people in America hated Dallas because of the Kennedy assassination, and how he thought that was, unfair, and that clearly the hype about there being a conspiracy or something was misplaced. I think those are subtle things from powerful writers that suggest to us, well, maybe we should have some doubt about those people who suggest that something else happened, that there may have been a conspiracy. So I think Lawrence Wright was on the wrong side of history there.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned early on that Lawrence Wright came on your radar because the Freedom Magazine, you were working for Freedom Magazine that was run by Scientology?
I freelanced for them.
Okay.
Basically, as I noted, they contacted me. Interestingly, I was meeting with a private investigator, as the book recounts, in Denver, and another reporter from the Denver Post who was facing the layoffs to come as the Denver Post was downsizing. And he mentioned to me at breakfast one morning that he had done a couple freelance pieces for Freedom Magazine, and they were interested in someone who had experience and could operate at a fairly high level as an investigative reporter, and asked if he could give them my name, which he did. And the church, the magazine editor, contacted me, and I went down to Florida. I met with him, I talked with him, and I wound up spending a considerable amount of time with people inside the Church of Scientology. And I traveled to Budapest and to Australia, to Ireland and England, talking with Scientologists and people within the church, and got to know things about the church that most people don't see. I met with David Miscavige, the leader of the church, and people who were close to him, and with various historians or people within the church who knew L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology. So I was given extraordinary access in the course of doing some work for them. I didn't write a lot for Freedom Magazine, but I did a tremendous amount of research that carried me into this story about Lawrence Wright.
Well, then a couple of questions. What was your impression of the Church of Scientology? I've done a lot of shows on this, interviewed a lot of people, and it's always been negative. I've always had a negative impression of them.
Yeah, that's right. And well, I've always operated as a journalist on the idea that the only way to really know what's going on is to get as close as you can. I did the same thing with the Chicago mob, and I've done the same thing with prisons and those sorts of things. And so getting on the inside of the Church of Scientology led me to understand that so much of the reporting about them has been prejudicial and has been driven by some ideas that were based on untruths. I think that a lot of the criticism of the Church of Scientology and the accusations against them are based on rumors and innuendo rather than on fact when you get right down to it. People make their assertions. There was an assertion that they ran a punishment camp at a place called Gold Base. I went down to Gold Base and I toured Gold Base and I met the people involved down there. I didn't find the same kinds of things about Scientologists that these critics seem to find. Most of them were interested in their own particular religious view, very different from the mainstream, but also very tolerant of other religions and other ideas. If you look behind the scenes, you find that the Church of Scientology has been involved in human rights activities supporting human rights in many places. I spent hours talking with David Miscavige. I asked him about these questions. I asked others about these issues. And they were always open with me. And not only that, but they would bring boxes of records into an office and open them up to me and let me look at whatever I wanted to look at. This is not the kind of attitude that I found of people that have hidden agendas and secret motives and are abusing people.
But you've never been inspired to write a book about that, or? Did I lose you? I think I did. No, you're still there, right?
Did I lose you?
No, we're there. We're here. That was weird. It's cut off for a second there. But were you ever inspired to write a book about Scientology?
Oh, you're breaking up. I'm sorry.
Okay. Were you ever inspired to write a book about Scientology?
It was Wright's book on Scientology that I examined.
No, but have you, Loser, have you ever been inspired to write a book about Scientology with your perception?
No, it really didn't. It didn't fall within my area of interest. The Manchurian Journalist does address issues about Scientology and about the media coverage. There's quite a bit of information in there about that, though most of it relates to journalism and to those things I discovered about efforts to in a clandestine way to propagandize the American public.
Gotcha. And so real quick, because you only have a couple of minutes left, so how much, did they give you any pre-investigative information about Wright before you started looking into Wright?
The only thing that they had done with Wright was to illustrate errors in his book. And they gave me access to their legal work and their legal efforts to counteract those things that Wright had said. But they weren't doing their own investigation into Lawrence Wright. That was my bailiwick. I was the one that provided detail and information about that from my own independent research.
It's a shame at the end we got this audio problems here, but we've been talking to Dan Luzetter. Now, you could find his book, The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, the CIA, and the Corruption of American Journalism. Too bad I don't have enough time to talk to you about, because you mentioned here, too, about how they color our perception of socialism and communism. I'd love to talk to you about that. Maybe when you have you come back on the next book. You can find him at danluzetter.com, and that is spelled L-U-Z-A-D-D-E-R, Luzetter. And also you can find him, too, on Twitter at Dan Luzetter. You got about 1 minute left. What do you want to leave us with?
Well, I think, for one, to thank you for having the opportunity to talk to you, but also I think we all need to think about the status of journalism today and what we need to do to correct the problems that exist, and how we need to redevelop some journalistic initiatives and some journalistic enthusiasm in this country for accurate, fair reporting, so that we can all make decisions based on facts, not based on supposition and speculation. I think that's probably one of the very important issues we face right now in this country.
Yeah, it would be nice to leave on a happy ending, right? But the thing is, Dan, when you got people like Laura Loomer, you know what I mean, are considered journalists, man, what are we going to do, man? What are we going to do? Just jump off a cliff?
Well, it's funny, though. I do remain optimistic that good communications will eventually will out, and that we can do better.
Okay, that's the happy ending. Thank you. So everyone's more optimistic than me, I'll tell you that. So you haven't accomplished much there. But Dan Luzetter, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and definitely come back about your Chicago outfit stuff, man. That sounds really good. What was the name of that again?
Guzik's Legacy.
Guzik's Legacy. Thank you so much. Dan Luzetter, danluzetter.com. Good night.